אם אי פעם הרגשתם תקועים באיזשהו תהליך יצירתי, כאשר פריצת דרך לא מגיעה משום מקום, שווה לכם מאוד לשמוע את השיחה שלנו. האורח שלי היום הוא פרופסור אדם אלתר, פרופסור לשיווק מאוניברסיטת ניו יורק. ולמעשה הוא כתב ספר שבדיוק מדבר על הנושא הזה, האנטומיה של פריצת הדרך, או איך לצאת מהתקיעות כשזה הכי חשוב. לפי פרופסור אלתר יש ממש כלים וטכניקות שאנחנו יכולים לעשות כדי לצאת מהמצב התקוע ולעזור לנו להגיע לפריצת דרך. אחד הדברים שדיברנו זה על הרעיון הזה של מתי מגיעים רעיונות יצירתיים ולמה זה נגד האינטואיציה שלנו ואיפה זה בדיוק הורס. אחת התובנות המרתקות שגיליתי מהספר שלו היה הפחד של אנשים מאינטרוספקציה. מחקרים מראים שאנשים לצורך העניין יעדיפו כאב פיזי ולא להישאר לבד עם המחשבות שלהם. למה הנטייה הזאת היא הרסנית כאשר אנחנו רוצים או צריכים לחשוב עוד קצת כדי להגיע לפריצת הדרך המיוחלת. זאת הייתה שיחה מרתקת ולא רק דיברנו על פילוסופיה אלא ממש נתנו טיפים וכלים פרקטיים כדי להגיע לפריצות דרך. אז אם כל הנושא הזה מעניין אתכם ואתם עוסקים בתהליכים יצירתיים, שווה לכם מאוד להקשיב לשיחה הזאת. שלום לכולם וברוכים הבאים לערוץ שלי. לי קוראים רועי יוזביץ' ובערוץ הזה אנחנו מזמינים את האורחים הטובים ביותר מכל העולם לדבר על פריצות דרך, אינטליגנציה מלאכותית, פילוסופיה, מדע, דת, אומנות ועוד. אם השיחה הזאת מעניינת אתכם, אתם מוזמנים להיכנס לשיחות נוספות בערוץ, גם בעברית וגם באנגלית, לקחת חלק בקהילה המדהימה שלנו להיכנס לטלגרם ולבוא למפגשי עוקבים. השיחה הזאת, כמו כל השיחות, היא בחסות יוזביץ', אז אם אתם רוצים לתמוך בעבודה החשובה שאנחנו עושים, אתם מוזמנים ללחוץ על כפתור ה-Thank you ולתרום, לעשות את זה דרך הפטריון, או להיכנס לחנות ולהזמין ספרים או קורסים דיגיטליים. אתם גם יכולים להזמין הרצאה שלי או על אינטליגנציה מלאכותית או על מהפכת ההשכלה ואיך ללמוד טוב יותר לארגון שלכם. ועכשיו, פרופסור אדם אלתר. Professor Adam Alter, thank you so much for coming. How are you today?
Thanks for having me, Roy. I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Difficult times in Israel, but we will get over it.
Right, of course.
Before we start, can we conduct this interview in Hebrew? Is your Hebrew sufficiently good?
No, it's definitely not. The last time I spoke Hebrew was about 26 years ago, so it's been a little bit too long for me, unfortunately. I know it's scattered words, but not more than that.
אני מבין.
אני מבין. אני לא מבין מספיק.
When was the last time that you visited Israel?
I've never visited Israel. I went to a Jewish school and it was a fairly religious Orthodox school. So I learned Tanakh and I did quite a lot of conversational Hebrew for a while and then even biblical Hebrew for a little while. But that was such a long time ago. I graduated in 1998 from high school. So it's been 26 years.
Wow. And okay, now this is not a good time to visit Israel, but I want to tell you in advance, this is not just like the pre-talk, because I think that some of the Jewish ideas regarding how to deal with being stuck are very interesting, and we will dive into those principles later on. And we are here to cover your latest book, The Anatomy of a Breakthrough. Just a second, I have this book over here. How to get unstuck when it matters most. Okay, so before we start, can you please say a few words regarding the title of your book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough? Why do we use the word anatomy?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are two reasons. It's a light pun, but the way I break down the book is into head, heart, and habit. And so it's broadly broken down in a way that maps onto parts of the body or functions of the body or functions of the brain, parts of what it is to be a human. So there's something anatomic about that. It's a little bit almost medical in the way I break it down. A lot of the examples are actually medicine-based and diagnostic-based and things like that. So that's part of it as well. But also I think the term anatomy much more broadly and abstractly just describes picking apart the bits of something so that you can understand it better. The body is incredibly complex, but if you're a doctor and you start taking little parts separately, it starts to become tractable. You can work with it. You can make sense of it. And so being stuck is a very big, overwhelming problem for a lot of people. And so just as you do as a doctor would do with the human anatomy, there's something useful about breaking it down into its parts and then dealing with each part one at a time.
In Western medicine, but in Eastern medicine, we don't treat one part at a time. We treat the wholeness of the body. And maybe in being stuck, it is not just the one thing. We need to regard, the maybe like this notion of looking at this part and then this part is insufficient in some terms or in some aspect regarding being stuck. What do you think?
I think that's true. I mean, I think that's always going to be true about almost everything we analyze as human beings. But I think this is one area where people don't start with the small stuff. They start with the big. They say, this is overwhelming. This is too abstract. It's too big. They start too Eastern and not enough Western. I think a lot of the time we start too Western and not enough Eastern. But in this case, when people say I'm stuck, it's just this one big sort of monolithic experience of negativity. And so if you can say, well, let's break it down. Let's talk about the emotions. Let's talk about the strategies you can use. Let's talk about what you should be doing behaviorally. That starts to demystify the process. I'm not saying you should only focus on one of them. I'm just saying you should focus on all of them. And then the holistic picture, when you put them all together in a very Eastern frame, is, I think, the best way to move forward.
This is great because in Stuck, we lean towards the Western versus the Eastern or the East. Wow, this is great. This is actually great stuff. Okay, before we dive into the idea of, or some of the ideas of your book, I'm a big fan of the concept of private language. And the idea of private language is when I say I'm stuck and when you say I'm stuck, more often than not, we are usually refer to two very different things, okay? Maybe in academic way, I didn't write a paper or I'm not managed to publish anything for the last, 2 or 3 years, and you say, I'm stuck. It's been 4 days since my last paper was published. So in your survey, in your research, when you wrote the book, how do different people interpret the term stuck, or how does it, how huge is the difference?
It's a good question. So there are certain kinds of stuckness that are universally recognized as being stuck. If you have no money and you can't afford to eat and drink and have shelter, you're stuck in a certain respect. And everyone agrees that's not a good place to be. But a lot of being stuck is subjective. As you say, there are ranges and there are different variations of how much people feel a particular thing needs to be done for them to feel like they're making progress. One of my favorite examples of this was I had a conversation with a friend of mine whose father is a math professor, or was a math professor. And he studied mathematics for decades and decades and decades. And he spent 30 years working on a single problem. And he didn't solve the problem. And he went, day after day after day for 30 years of his life. And his son, my friend, said to him one day, you've been doing this for a very long time. You must feel incredibly frustrated. From the outside, it looks like you've made absolutely no meaningful progress in your life. And his father said, that's absolutely opposite of how I feel. Every incremental step I make in the right direction for this huge problem feels like rewarding work. Every day I go to work energized at the prospect that I'm going to make small steps forward, which will change in some small way how humanity operates, because this was a very big math puzzle. And I thought that was totally profound and interesting that this guy could, from the outside, make no meaningful progress. He's not making a particular amount of money that he can show, today I made this amount of money, or I solved 3 problems today. He's not making any of that meaningful progress, but for him, he doesn't feel stuck because he's moving forward in the ways that matter to him. So there is a tremendous amount of variance when we say I'm stuck. It could be something where someone else would say, I don't feel stuck at all. But for you, that experience is subjectively negative and it feels like you're stuck.
So again, stuck, from what I get from your great example, is almost totally a subjective thing.
It is, except in those extreme cases where we all recognize that a particular instance is so gravely bad.
Yes, but you said it's like in the COVID that we all of us were stuck and we couldn't do anything. This is not the kind of stuck that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the kind of stuck that other people can, that I have apparently all the facilities or most or some of the facilities to conquer, but somehow I don't.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. So I'm not interested in momentary frustration. This book is not about, it's frustrating for the next 10 minutes, I can't do what I want to do. It's really about long-term, big, profound stuckness where you have some agency, where there's something you can do to fix the problem. So if it's the example that you mentioned, this COVID example was, if you wanted to travel during COVID, a lot of countries had a lockdown and you couldn't travel. There's nothing you can do about that. You are physically stuck, but there's not much you can do about it. I don't think that's psychologically particularly interesting. What's more interesting to me is that most people, most of the time, are stuck in certain ways where they have agency. They just don't know what to do or they can't unstick themselves. And that's what this book is about.
I think 2 months ago, I had a conversation with Dr. Tim Pitchell. He wrote the book about procrastination, and he's like an expert in procrastination. He timed every bit of his calendar in frames of 15 minutes for the last 15 years. So one can argue he knows nothing about procrastination because he never procrastinated. Nevertheless, he said something that that strikes me, because we tend to think that once you are a procrastinator as a trait, as a personality trait, you will procrastinate in every domain. But it's not like this at all. Some of us when we procrastinate in a specific field or discipline, it means something. And in the concept of stuck, I can go into the academic, the business, the corporate, the relationship, and the individual. How do I progress myself? How do I better myself? And how do I start with my kids, for example? So I have at least 5 very different domains that are almost orthogonal. That in one domain I can be very good, and in other domains I can be very lousy. So how do you reconcile between those different things?
Yeah, this is a huge question, I think, for academics in general. You discover a phenomenon or you're looking at a puzzle and you ask yourself, is this just about this small thing, or is this about everything? How much similarity, how much overlap is there? So, the classic case is intelligence. What does it mean to be intelligent? And you can be musical, you can be good at building things, you can be good at mathematics, you can be good at writing novels. There are lots of kinds of intelligence. And one of the big questions for cognitive scientists has always been, how much do they overlap? If you're good at music, does that mean you're likely to be good at maths? Something like that. And I think this is similar in some respects, that there is some overlap, but not perfect overlap. So when you're stuck financially, there's a certain set of problems that mean that you're more likely to become stuck financially that are a little bit different from, but overlap with being stuck as a parent, or being stuck in a creative pursuit, or being stuck at work when you're trying to do whatever it is that you're trying to do. Every work has different outputs. So I think there are some key central ideas that I try to explore in the book that apply broadly across all kinds of stuckness. But then for every domain, there are going to be very specific things that happen where you've got to kind of go beyond the book to try to figure out how to solve that particular instance of stuckness. But I do think there's a lot of overlap.
Because from what I get from your book, and please correct me if I'm wrong, your book is more lean towards, the creative, academic, corporate kinds of stuck, and less the relationship, parental, or how to better myself. I don't know how to say it in English. If there is like a word, the inner self. Yeah? Mm-hmm. How do you, like in Hebrew, how do you work on your virtues? Okay.
Yeah.
It's not like this at all. So it's not. I am a very angry man, and I want to diminish this virtue of anger, and I'm stuck with this endeavor. And I think that in your book won't give me what I need in terms of why is it? Because it seems that to being stuck on something so important on one side and internal, private on the other side, it's way different than being stuck in a creative process.
It's very different. It does come up in the book, but I'm not a psychotherapist and I've never studied clinical psychology beyond very basic undergraduate courses. It's never been my focus. So it would have been disingenuous for me to try to write a book that helps people with their personal problems in a way that you're describing, how to deal with anger. I have some ideas about that just from my research over time, but it's not central to what I do. And so I didn't want to write that kind of book. Having said that, the whole first chunk of the book is about demystifying what it is to be stuck and then the emotional responses that are helpful. And I think a lot of that applies to the kind of internal stuckness you're mentioning, the self-help kind of virtue-based stuckness. I do think there's some overlap. It's not the primary aim of the book. The book is much more about the kind of work that I do, which is, as you say, how do you break out of a creative block? How do you do better at work? How do you do better financially? Things like that, which is much more sort of a business school orientation rather than a clinical psychology orientation. But I think a lot of the same ideas apply. It's just not the focus of the book. And if you read the book, there's some interesting philosophy in there from psychotherapists, people like Tara Brach and others who have ideas about how to pause, how to stop and slow things down, which I think is incredibly useful for a lot of those kinds of more internal stucknesses. But again, it's not the central focus of the book.
Okay, so let's start with, I think one of the first, it's not the first example, but I think it is very important. I think it's central to our discussion today, and this is a creative cliff illusion. Okay, so I have some questions regarding the creative cliff illusion and some problems with the creative cliff illusion. But I think it will be better for you to first just lay out the term, what does it mean, and how we can apply it in the context of being stuck. Okay.
Yeah, so the creative cliff illusion is this idea that when you ask people, for example, try to come up with as many creative uses for a paperclip as you can, or a brick, or a piece of paper, or it doesn't matter what the object is. And you say to them, do you think the best ideas you have will be in the first 5, or will they be ideas 16 to 20, once you've been thinking for a while? And almost everyone says, in the beginning, it's really easy. I can come up with some good ideas very early on. And I think those will be my good ideas. And by the time I'm thinking of ideas 16, 17, 18, it's so difficult at that point. All my good ideas are gone. And I think I'm going to fall off a creative cliff, essentially. So my creativity goes and goes and goes. And then eventually I get to a point where it gets really difficult. And then I drop off a cliff and I'm no longer able to come up with good ideas. The reason it's called a creative cliff illusion is because that's actually not true. So what happens with most people is they come up with 5 or 6 ideas and then they stop. They say, this is too hard. I don't want to continue. But if you persevere, if you go through ideas 10, 15, onto 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, those ideas that you have, although they are much more difficult to come by, they tend to be much more divergent from the herd. So they're more unusual. They're more different from the things that you generally think about. So they're more unusual given the context of what you normally consider. And that makes them more creative. That makes them better ideas in general. So although we think we're going to fall off a creative cliff, there's a kind of creative launch pad that we hit later on when things get difficult. And so the creative cliff illusion is just the description of this tendency to believe that we're going to become less creative over time, whereas either we persist in being creative or we become even more creative.
Okay, so very good summary. Okay, now let's fight. Okay, now
okay.
The idea of like the 15 to 20 to 25 is going to be much more divergent from the first because all the out of the box idea, you just ran out of them after 5 or 6 or 8 trials. And the idea of paperclips or name as many different uses to paperclips as you can. I think that Ken Robinson was, in his TED Talk, we popularized this concept. My question is, we know that the notion of creativity is something new that is also useful. Okay, it's not just new; it also needs to be useful. And with regarding to the creative cliff illusion, okay, the idea is when do I want to use the analogy of the creative cliff, and when do I want to say, okay, I don't have enough ideas. This is not a good place to go. I don't need more ideas to users of paperclip. I need to pivot and quit. Okay, where I can say, okay, I just need to work harder. And when do I say, no, this is a dead end?
Yeah, so this is the classic problem, right? It's on the one end of the spectrum, you've got these wonderful books about persevering, books like Grit. The harder you work, the more tenacity you have, the more you keep going, the better.
Atomic Habits.
Atomic Habits, another example.
And just write each day write one joke, like the Seinfeld, and eventually you will become much better in writing jokes.
Right. So that's one perspective, right? The other perspective is, what are you doing writing jokes every day? You're obviously not a very good joke teller. Move on, do something else. You've only got one life. There's an opportunity cost to writing jokes. Find something else, bounce around. There are a million things you could be doing. Why get stuck on something that you're doing that you don't like? So then you've got books like Quit by Annie Duke. And that book says the opposite. It says the opportunity cost of anything you're doing is high because you leave behind all the things you aren't doing. So the question is, you can't always quit. You can't always have grit and do Atomic Habits and keep going. There's got to be some sort of way of distinguishing these two. I think that's the classic question. Now, I think that's separate from the creative cliff. I think the creative cliff illusion presupposes that you're going to continue for a certain amount of time. And people think that if I say I'm going to do this task for an hour, I'm going to get worse over the hour, whereas actually you get better over the hour. So that's that one issue. The second question you're asking, which is a bigger, I think, more interesting philosophical question, is, why are you spending the hour doing that in the first place? Maybe you shouldn't be asking questions about paper clips for an hour. Maybe you should give yourself 10 minutes. And then when it gets hard, maybe there's some good ideas down the line, but it's not worth spending 45 more minutes on the task. And that's a good question. So one of the things that the authors of the Creative Cliff Illusion have told me is that what the illusion suggests is that in general, we don't spend quite enough time on tasks. They don't say you should go forever. You shouldn't be sitting in a creative pursuit forever. But if you think you need 10 minutes, give yourself 15, because there's likely that extra 5 minutes is likely to bear fruit. And then you can quit. Then you can move on to the next thing. And I think that's a really useful idea, that in general, humans quit too soon. That's my sense. Not always. Sometimes we persevere and perseverate and don't stop, and then we waste our time. But I think as a species, when things get hard, we move on. And that's only been exacerbated by the presence of phones. And, smartphones mean that anything that gets hard, you're in an elevator for a minute or you're sitting in a subway, you pull out your phone and you make the experience easier. We've learned to do that with hard experiences. And the lesson from the Creative Cliff Illusion is, it's okay if things are hard. You could still produce very good ideas.
Okay. So again, the idea is that the Creative Cliff Illusion presuppose that what you are seeking for is worth your time. Okay. Yes. And more often than not, when we quit, it's too early. And since I'm a ultra-Orthodox, can you see it? Okay.
Right. Yep.
So I want to weigh in with something from our Jewish origins. Okay. And in the Talmud, we have this notion of there is a whole of difference between learning a chapter 100 times and learning a chapter 101 times. And this is very, very, very strange. One can see that there is a difference between one and twice or 3 times, but 100 and 101. And the idea is that 100 is a whole number. Wow, I just finished 100 times. But if you're prepared to do the extra mile after the whole number, if you're prepared to do, instead of 10, give me the 15, there is nothing that I can learn more after 100 times. Nevertheless, I'm going to pursue, I'm going to do it once more. Great stuff will come. And I think that this a little bit resonates with what you just said. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a sort of philosophy that goes along with learning a particular Talmudic verse 101 times. You could certainly start something fresh and get lots of value from something new that you've never looked at before. But if you're the kind of person who looks deeply and goes for the 101st time, I think that suggests something about the way you perceive the world that's very valuable. That you aren't just someone who's drawn to round numbers. That's how we work. We all count with our fingers and our toes, and we count to 10 and 100, and everything's the base 10 system. So the number 100 becomes this sort of, I don't know, just it's not a necessary goal, but it's the kind of thing that we all focus on because it's a round number. And so if you're the kind of person who says, I want to run exactly 1 mile or 10 miles, or I want to learn this verse 100 times, the thing that's motivating you, the goal, is just this extrinsic accident that it just so happens that we count using base 10 system. And that's not a good reason to do things in life. It's not the best reason to do things. That I must have $100,000. I must, all these sort of round numbers that drive us on. That's not the way to spend our time. But if you are sufficiently motivated to understand a Talmudic verse to read it 101 times, that signals something that you're going way beyond just being drawn to a particular number. This is intrinsically important to you. And I think that's what I take from that idea. And that's why going the extra mile makes sense in that case.
Now, many people, I think, I don't know if most of my, but a big portion of my viewers are students in undergraduate and graduate students. And with your permission, I want to take advantage of you. Okay, I don't know if this is a correct term. I don't know, but don't give me the paperclip example because I can do nothing with it. Okay, let's take the paperclip example into academia. Okay, and it's not that I'm going to give me 10 hypothetical research questions for your next research. It's not like this. So if you can please translate the idea of the paperclip or the creative cliff illusion to things that you do on a daily basis with your student or with a student that needs to write code or needs to do research literature survey or anything that related to academia.
Well, I'm not sure if you're telling me not to use this example, but this is obviously the natural one, is to say that before you start on something, before you decide it's the best way to go, let's reconsider it. Let's consider it for 50% longer than you maybe had originally budgeted for. So I teach a lot of MBA students. So I'm going to take it out of the world of academia and move it into what it's like to be an MBA student. A lot of my students are very creative. They're entrepreneurs. They're trying to start new businesses. And inevitably, I give my first 2 or 3 lectures. My semester is 28 classes or 26 classes. And I give the first 2 or 3, and I have always 5 or 6 students will come to me and say, can we have a meeting? I want to talk to you about my business ideas. And I always say, yes, that's fine. And then we have a meeting and they say, here's my big idea. It's great. I think it's going to work. I just need your help. Like, how do I market it appropriately? Because I'm a marketing professor. And so we talk about that. And my first response always is, how many ideas have you discarded before you came to me with this one? Is this the first idea you had when you started grad school? Have you been thinking about it for 10 years? Have you got 5 other ideas that you think this is the best among those ideas? And that's always where we begin. And I think all of that is about the creative cliff illusion. It's that sense that this idea just fell on me from above, like it was divinely dropped on my head. Yes. And that's the idea I've now got to spend my next 6, 7, 10 years on. But no one spends enough time considering the alternatives. I've never had a student who comes and says, I had 100 ideas, and until I got to 100 or 101, I didn't get that far. I just said, I got a couple of ideas, I'm going to take the best one. And I think the lesson is that you need to go through the process of coming up with 100 ideas to know what is a good idea. And it's a little bit like book writing. So I always think, okay, I want to write this book. I've got this great idea today, and I'm going to spend the next 3 years working on this project. But I don't do that anymore. And it's the same with the book title, actually. I never choose a book that I'm going to write, a topic or a book title or a research project, without coming up with at least 100 examples of things that are not as good, because that's the only way you know if you're really coming up with the best ideas and spending your time and energy on the best ones. So that's how I use it with both my students, my academic students, and with my MBA students.
I try to take some of what you said to the world of startup industry. Mm-hmm. And in the startup industry, it seems, that they're doing something right, like books from 0 to 1 and the Lean Startup. And I think the idea of the book, The Lean Startup, is you have no idea what your product is, what your customers want, and how do they going to use your product. And this is a very long process of reevaluation and asking your customers, and you don't even know, in most cases, what to ask. And this is a process that you must do. And this, I think, leans to the agile concept. You always need to reevaluate, recheck. And I think this resonates with what you said. You don't know the answers. You don't know how good idea manifest themselves into reality.
Yeah, that's right. And broadly speaking, in the world of evolutionary biology, I talk about this in the book as well, you can either explore or you can exploit. And exploration is this process of gathering as many ideas as you can, of being shallow and dancing around from one thing to the next. If you're an artist, try 10 different styles. If you're a book writer, try 10 different types of books. If you're a researcher, think of 10 different research topics. It doesn't matter what the area is, you've got to explore, because once you get to the point where you shift over to exploit, to drill down and spend all your time and energy on this one thing, you better make sure that's a thing worth spending your time on. And you will never know if it is if you haven't explored first. You have to know what the discarded alternatives look like to know that the one that you're investing in is worth investing in. And so I think that's an incredibly useful philosophy in life, that you should spend a huge amount of time saying no, 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 so that when you get to the yes, it stands out, it shines out and says to you, that is a real yes, and that's worth spending all my time and energy on.
You know, there is a joke, you know, getting a decision means that you're too tired of keep thinking about it.
Right.
I don't know how to say, but you know, before we go to so we had the creative cliff illusion that more often than not, your more creative ideas will come later on in the road. Before we go on to the other tool, you mentioned that people often feel stuck in various aspects of their life, but rarely share those experiences. Okay. And I know it with my undergraduate students, you know, they feel stuck, they feel that they don't understand anything, and they feel all the other students understand completely. And the idea of not sharing this emotion of being stuck, of not understanding, is very bad. And my question is, what can we do as a society to change it? And can we say something regarding millennials versus Gen Z with respect to share stuck feelings?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a culture of self-selling. You know, we sell ourselves. We're constantly selling ourselves. There's a great book by Dan Pink, To Sell is Human. And the argument is that it's a fantastic book, and Dan's a wonderful writer and thinker. And his argument, which I think is exactly right, is that humans are kind of wired to promote. We promote ourselves to potential mates so we can find partners and have children. We promote ourselves in business. We promote ourselves to make money, to find food. We are constantly promoting. And there's something about that mindset that's very ingrained in us that makes it very difficult to reveal weaknesses and foibles and insecurities, even if they're universal. You know, like it's been very interesting for me. I have two children, and my kids are 6 and 7, sorry. And for the last 7 years, I've been very interested in this world of dads online who kind of share what it's like to be a dad, because I had no idea what it was going to be like to be a father until I had kids. And it was much harder in some ways than I anticipated. And there's a whole kind of cottage industry of dad bloggers and writers and YouTube people who say, here are all the things you didn't know that were going to be hard about being a dad, and let me just tell you about them. And I find that really empowering to know that I'm not the only one going through certain experiences. And I think there needs to be a kind of cultural shift that says that, yes, you can sell yourself. Yes, you can sell yourself to partners and to whatever, businesses and whatever else. But a part of being a really sort of well-rounded human being who is also socially appealing, I think, one part of selling yourself is to reveal a little bit of your vulnerability. And so to the extent that we can change that norm, and I think it is changing. You asked about the different generations. I think younger generations are a little bit better about being sort of in touch with what it means to be the pluses and minuses of life. Even looking at what the economic situation is like for younger people. You know, there's so much written about the fact that, especially in the United States, and I'm not sure about many other parts of the world, but it's very, very hard for young people, for millennials and younger, to afford homes for various reasons. There are a whole lot of economic reasons. That's something that was seen as a birthright in the United States for Gen X, the boomers, all these other generations before. And I think that sense of sort of generational vulnerability has made younger people better about saying, things are hard for me, and let me tell you about them. And I think it's very good for us to have that kind of openness about what we struggle with.
And the idea that you just mentioned about YouTube blogs and all social media, then again, if you want, and Dan is great. I had the honor of having him on the show, and To Sell is Human basically says that selling is to influence you to give up some of your asset for something better. And educators and medical doctors and our sellers, because I want you to take your time and money and I will give you education. And I think the idea of to sell is human is terrific. Is really terrific. But again, to sell is human rhymes on to err is human.
Mm-hmm.
To err is human. And this is why Dan came up with the title. And to err is human. To share your vulnerability is so human. And the idea of social media is so important. So okay, what can I do with all this? Should I share, or if I don't want to share, just go and find social media or YouTube blogs that deal with what you're dealing right now and see whether your stuckness is profoundly different than the stuckness of everybody else.
I think there are two things. One thing is to do that, to educate yourself. So, I have my particular insecurities. Let me find out if other people have them, and then let me be exposed to what other people say about it. I think that's very useful in a sort of self-therapy way. It makes me feel better about my life. I don't know that that's all you need to do, though. I think that's sort of one step. The other step for me is, if you are lucky enough to have close friends, people you trust, people you can be vulnerable with, that's a tremendous human asset if you have that. And then it's, I think, very worthwhile to go to those friends and not just have fun together and go out and have a drink or whatever you like to do, but to also say, here are the things that I feel vulnerable about. And one interesting thing about self-disclosure, when I tell you what's hard for me, it makes you more likely to tell me what's hard for you. And that's actually how you build human closeness. It's not by, hey, look how far I can throw this ball and look how much money I made. You never get close to people that way. You get close to people by revealing what is weakest and least likable about you, by being a little bit vulnerable and saying, here are the 3 things that worry me. What do you think? And then the person says, well, that's interesting. I'm worried about that too. So I think there's a global social media version of this. Go find out what other people are saying. But I think there's a more valuable, more enriching version, which is one-on-one. Go have a coffee with someone. And while you're talking about whatever you're talking about, say, can I get your opinion about this thing? It's been worrying me for a while, and I'm interested to hear what you think. And that's how you build closeness. And I think also demystify these issues where we tend to get stuck and ruminate too much.
And we can take this very idea and transform it into the idea of the world of academia. Uri Alon from Weizmann Institute said that the entire industry of paper writing is, we went from point A to point B in a straight line, but it is never the case in real life, because in real life we wanted to go from A to C and we stumble. And in this, Uri Alon called it the cloud or the fog of research. You just, okay, maybe it's not point C, it's point B, and it's not straight line. It is never a straight line, and it goes like this. So even in the process of paper writing, when you write a paper, say, okay, we started here and we wanted to go here, and this is the shortest line. It is never the case in real life, and we rarely know, or we are rarely familiar, if we don't have like a mentor or a tutor to explain that this is even not close to how real research in real life is conducted.
Yeah, it's true. I had that illusion for a long time as an undergrad when I thought that I maybe wanted to become an academic. I thought that these things were much more linear than they are, and that you have an idea. If it's a good idea, it turns into 5, 6, 10, 20 papers, and suddenly you have a career. And it's just not how it works at all. The number of changes I've made in my career, jumping from one topic to another, or even within a single paper saying, here's what I thought this paper was going to look like. There are 5 iterations that have brought me away from that original idea. And now we arrive at the paper that I'm actually writing. And that doesn't mean the paper gets worse with each change. It often gets better and richer and more interesting, but it's never a straight line. One thing I really like is there are some people, I don't know if you've seen this, they write CVs of failure. So if you look at a resume, it's fantastic.
Never.
So it's great. So there's a guy, Johannes Haushofer. I don't know how you pronounce his name exactly, but he was at Princeton, and he's moved back to Europe. I can't remember exactly which school, unfortunately, but he has done this, and it's fantastic. And it's a CV where instead of talking about all his successes, which is what you're supposed to do, you sell yourself, He says, here's a paper that I published. These are the number of journals where it got rejected. This is the number of times I had to write the paper. Here's my job. This is the number of job applications I had to make before I got this job. This is the number of times I got interviewed and failed at this point. He goes through and he basically says, if you had to turn a CV into a document that was an accurate representation of your past, which is really what it's supposed to be, curriculum vitae, it's a list of your life. It's basically a summary of your life.
Vita. This is right. This is actually the vita.
Right, exactly. And so he says, well, let's make it a real reflection of life. And so then you see, as you say, all the bouncing between the 2 points that get you from A to B. And that's tremendously empowering, especially for young people who think that the world is just going to be this straight path.
Wow. And even if you're not going to send this CV PDF to your next employers, it is very important that you have this CV. I have a Notion page of all the bad comments that I got on YouTube. And I keep all the bad comments, all the failures. And since I have over 200,000 views monthly, so I get a lot of bad comments. Okay. And this is very important, that if, someone said, you are talented, the idea of talented, you were born with this trait. No, I was not. Okay, let's move with your permission to another tool. And I will let you choose, the other tool. What is in your opinion, after we explored the creative cliff illusion, what is the next tool that we need to think when we want to get out of being stuck?
So one thing that I really like, that I've always found very useful, and this applies to many, many domains, is that humans really prize originality. We like the idea of something being original and new and different. Academia is supposed to be a collection of original ideas. One of the things I was told is you can be a very good student, you can learn everybody else's ideas, and then when you're tested on them in an exam, you can churn them out and you can write them down and you'll get an A+. But there's a very different skill when it comes to generating original content. You have to come up with something new that no one's ever come up with before. It's a totally different skill. And one problem with that view is that it fetishizes radical originality. Like there's nothing that's ever been like this before. And that is vanishingly rare in the world. Almost nothing is radically original. And I talk about in the book a lot of examples of this. Like I start by talking about music. That if you ask people, who was the Western musician who was the most original musician of the 20th century? And the most common response among other musicians, experts, is Bob Dylan. They say Bob Dylan. No one had the voice like Dylan. He's got this very specific voice. The way he wrote music he was totally original. And when you read these comments from other people, some of them in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they're saying Dylan was an original. They kept using the term original. There's no one like him. But actually, that's not true. It's just not true at all. It's not true. In fact, when you look at the origins, the roots of Dylan's music, and it's not true when you speak to Dylan himself, who says, I combined folk and pop and punk and rock, and I was just sort of an amalgamation of all these ideas. And what I produced was a bit different, but really I was building on these different foundations that had been created elsewhere. And this happens over and over and over again, that we from the outside see something and think this is totally new. So the question is, what should you do? If you're a business person and you want to come up with a new business, trying to find something truly original is almost impossible. But the idea that Dylan and many other successful people use is to recombine old ideas in new ways. So I have this journal, this list. It's about 20 years old now of good ideas. It's just every good idea that I come across. And if I were ever thinking I want to start a business or I want to do a new research project, I go to this document and I take 2 random ideas and I say, can they be combined in a way that I've never seen combined before? That recombination approach, taking old things and combining them in new ways, is an incredibly powerful way to make progress when you're stuck in almost any domain.
Just a second. Do you have this list online always with you?
It's on my, it's in Dropbox. It's there. It's sitting there.
Okay. Can you, I'm not asking you to, share screen, but can you give me just one idea that you consider a good idea? Just one out of this. Just one.
It's funny. It's interesting you asked that question. So there was an idea.
I'm rude. I'm an Israeli rude.
No. That's not rude at all. I think that's a great question. So 15 years ago, I came across this product that a student at Harvard had come up with. It's this little clock, alarm clock. It's called Clocky. There's actually a business case about it that I used to teach occasionally. It's an alarm clock that in the morning, instead of the alarm going off and you have to hit the sleep button, the alarm clock has wheels. It jumps off your table and it runs around your room. A lot of people know about this product, yes. But that's an example.
And you need to get up in order to shut it down.
So that's, I've done a lot of writing about social media, about how much time we spend on screens. So here's an example of how you can use that idea. The idea of the Clocky is not so much that it's on wheels and that's a great idea. It's that, as you say, that the most disruptive thing to sleep is physical movement. If you can get people to actually get out of bed, that's 90% the way to having them wake up. So that's a good idea. But the same is true when you're in a stupor watching TV. You know, you're watching Netflix or you're watching YouTube. It doesn't matter what it is, some video content. And one thing we know is that people binge watch. They spend hours and hours watching. So how do you use Clocky to fix your binge watching? Well, one thing you can do is you can have an alarm clock somewhere else in your house that rings every hour and forces you to get up to stop watching whatever you're watching on the TV if you don't want to be watching for too long. So you just set that alarm. The same way as Clocky wakes you up, this alarm wakes you up from watching Netflix for hours at a time. Now, you can continue. You keep sleeping after you turn off Clocky. You can keep watching Netflix after you go into the other room and turn off the alarm.
But you're much less likely
to.
Yes.
Exactly.
I have a friend who is a school principal, and he said that the only thing that he forces his pupils to do is a 1 mile run at 6 a.m. in the morning. After that, they can sleep. But no one can sleep after 1 mile running in 6 a.m. in the morning. But now, there is a joke that I didn't invent. It was invented by Tom Lehrer, that if you steal from one research, it plagiarizes. If you steal from 10 research, it is research. So the idea is that most research is incremental. So what can I do with the idea of being stuck? Do I need to just think, listen, Roy, you don't need to be that original. You just need, to combine one A with B, like the Dilbert principle, and this will be sufficiently good, and this will get me out of being stuck. How do I utilize the concept of originality is overrated?
So I think the mistake is thinking there is such a thing as originality. The version of originality that we hew to, that we think is real, that represents the best products in the world, the best ideas, the best everything, it doesn't exist. There's no such thing. One of the assignments I had to do as an undergrad that changed my view of the whole world was, in psychology, there was a thing called the cognitive revolution. I know you've interviewed some people who are associated with that on your show. And it changed the way humans thought about the human psychology. It changed the way we did psychology, we practiced it, the way we consumed ideas, the way we thought the brain worked, and so on. It was very profound. And people called it the revolution because they said it changed everything. Paradigm shift, Thomas Kuhn, everything's different. But my assignment was to write about how that wasn't true, that it was a recombination of old ideas. And I had to go back and read old traditional psychology from the 30s, the 20s, the 40s, over 100 years ago, and say how this was just building on, it was standing on the shoulders of giants, and that actually this wasn't original, it was just a recombination. And I did, and I wrote it, and I thought it was a good essay that I wrote, because not because I wrote a good essay, it was a good idea to have that assignment, because it showed me that even these things we think of as these very sort of profound shifts are not profound shifts a lot of the time. Or if they are profound, they're still not as profound as we think they are. So that's a long way of saying that striving for something truly original is, I think, a fool's errand. You are not going to get there because it just basically doesn't exist. The best thing you can do is to have a product that you're very proud of, but say it's okay if the building blocks of that product, if the foundations of the product existed before, that I can trace the origin, the lineage of that product to something else. That's okay. That doesn't mean you say every combination is good. It has to be a good recombination. So you've still got to scrutinize it carefully. But to say it has to be so mind-blowingly different that no one ever thought about it before, you are never going to get anywhere doing that. And if you're ever going to approach radical originality, it's going to be after you have 10 recombination ideas, and it's going to take time. So striving for it today is generally not the best path forward.
And again, most research done in academia, most products done in the industry are not like this. People tend to think or have the concept of nostalgia that you also mentioned in the book, that iPhone was a revolutionary idea. But in fact, if you do remember, iPhone is just an iPod Touch with a SIM card. And one cannot distinguish between iPod Touch and iPhone. In the first version, we don't remember iPod Touch anymore, but it was the iPod, and then the iPod bigger, and then we had the iPod Touch, and then we just had the iPhone, which was an incremental thing to the iPod Touch. And this is like, it's very, very, I think it's very important. Just had like one hour ago a conversation with one of my graduate students and said, yeah, I want to come with like the paper that will change the world. I said, no, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Okay, before we move on, there is idea of introspection that you mentioned, and it is so devastating to read and to observe. You discussed the human tendency to avoid introspection, and you citing studies where people preferred physical discomfort over being left alone with their thoughts. And this is why solidarity in prisons is so horrible, because we don't want to stay alone. We can't speak with ourselves. Okay, so how can I change it? And how does the understanding of this feature help me get unstuck?
Yeah, it's this very profound study that you're referring to, where people were put in a room and they were told, you're going to spend a bit of time here on your own. You can sit in the corner and just sit with your own thoughts. They didn't have phones. They didn't have paper or pens. They were just sitting there. So just you and your thoughts. But in the corner of the room was a device that delivered electric shocks. So they were told, if you get bored and you want to try that out, you can use this device. And they had already experienced that device earlier on, so they knew that it felt painful. So the choice they were faced with in that moment was, do you want to sit here and just think about things, just explore your thoughts, or do you want to experience physical pain? And a lot of people chose physical pain. They sat for a couple of minutes, then they went over to the machine. Some of them shocked themselves over and over and over again, because humans like stimulation. They like stimulation more than the pain of having to explore their own thoughts. That's the kind of message there. Now, that's a study that for me is very much rooted in our time. This is a study that I think lives particularly strongly in the age of social media, where sitting with your own thoughts is not something anyone knows how to do anymore. We never do that. No one sits on a mode of public transport, on a bus, on a train. No one sits in the car. No one stands in an elevator. No one waits at the doctor's office. No one does anything without a phone. And so the minute you get bored, your natural response, your instinctive response, is to pull out the phone to paper over the difficulty or the complexity or the unpleasantness of that experience. And that means that your threshold for boredom and discomfort, intellectual discomfort, having to think about things, has dropped further and further and further over time. And we as a species now have absolutely no tolerance for introspection, for thought. We would rather get a device out to paper that over, which has all sorts of terrible consequences, I think, for creativity, for stuckness. I think it makes us much more stuck when we don't let our minds wander. And so that's the idea here, that we because of using the phone constantly and so on, we get into this position. You asked, what can we do about this? I think the best thing you can do is to treat thinking introspectively as a kind of muscle, like being mindful, doing yoga, whatever you like to do. You have to learn how to do that over time, because it requires being purposefully idle, of not doing certain things. So one thing you can do is, whenever you step into an elevator in the next 3 months, don't take out your phone. Just stand there. Just get used to exercising the muscle of standing there and thinking. No one else in the elevator will do that. Everyone else will pull out a phone, but you can do that. If you're getting in a car and you're going for a drive that's 10 or 15 minutes long, just sit there. Just drive. If you're sitting in a subway, a bus, a train, whatever, just sit there for a little bit and just think. Try that and make it longer and longer periods over time. And that will do a lot of the work of making it something that you're used to again, that you're comfortable thinking about whatever's going on in your own head. And it's a tremendously valuable muscle to exercise.
You know, I must tell you, I had a conversation both with Danny Kahneman and Richard Nisbett, and both of them told me the exact same thing. In order to be good at academia, and both of them were tremendously good, you need to be a little bit bored. You can't, you know, and I don't know what's your age, but I'm young in the ladder of academia, and we're running all the time. We run, you know, to be an assistant professor, to be an associate professor, to be a full-time professor, and for grants and everything. And Danny Kahneman and Richard Nisbett and Lee Ross, he said, you know, that Lee Ross was exactly the same thing. He was very lazy. This is what Nisbett told me about Lee Ross. He told me that he beat out 2 books out of Lee Ross. And in order to be a good academic, you need to have this ability to be bored, you know, to don't let thoughts wave in and digest them. And we don't do it anymore. And it's very hard in academia. And this is why they came up with such an, I don't want to say original because we just mentioned, you know, the idea, but they came up with such mind-blowing research. And what can we do? You're in academia right now. It seems that academia has changed in the last, 20 years, that we can't afford to do what Richard Nisbett and Danny Kahneman did 30 or 40 years ago.
No, it's a huge problem. I'm on a lot of committees writing letters for people who are coming up for tenure. And this is the big thing, that you get these really frustrating letters written by other scholars who say things like, you know, this person has 7 good publications and 3 not so good publications, and that's a small number compared to these other people who have 12. And who cares? If you have one that changes the world, that means more than 100 publications that no one ever reads. So spend your time focusing on that. But you can't do that in academia because everything is numbers. It's all quantitative. And so let's see. Let's look at the tally. How many things have we got here? And it's funny you mentioned Danny Kahneman and Dick Nisbett and Lee Ross, and these giants of psychology and giants of science, because I think there's this really interesting pairing of traits to be a really good academic. You need to be unbelievably lazy at the right times. That gives you this distance from ideas. You've got to have this sort of, if ideas are right in front of your face, like think about when you're really busy, you can't have good creative ideas. You can't think in interesting ways. So you've got to be bored and lazy enough to have the space for good ideas. So when you read about Kahneman and Tversky, they were walking around the Stanford campus for hours, just walking and walking and walking in the summers, just coming up with ideas, having chats. And from one perspective, that's laziness in academia. You're supposed to be there at the grindstone, churning out ideas. You've got to have that, but you also have to be unbelievably productive when it's time to be productive. There are a lot of people who are very lazy, who are not productive. But the thing about someone like Lee Ross, yes, you can say that he was lazy, and he probably, I don't know him, I didn't know him nearly as well.
I didn't say it.
No, right. So Dick Nisbett might say he was lazy, and that may be true, but he was tremendously productive as well. So there's this interesting dichotomy where you have to give yourself the space, but when it's time to get the work done, you can't just be idle. You have to be really strategically productive.
Okay. Wow. Yes. And you didn't give me a solution because, again, time has changed, but you're absolutely right. You know, Dennis Prager, and which leads me, I think, to one of my last questions. I think in one of his book tells a story that when he was young and he needed to go praying, he told his rabbi, "I'm not feel like praying." And his rabbi said, "How does feel like has anything to do with go to praying?" And the idea is, and one can see the exact same thing in Stephen King on writing. You just sit there from 11 a.m. until you write your 2,000 words. And after many, many days, the muse will come. And Stephen King said, I think in my case, the muse is not a lady, it's a guy, and he will come. But first you need to do it, and you need to do it repeatedly over and over. And this is not exactly like the creative cliff, because even if you don't have creative, you just need to do what you need to do, like the labor, the boring task over and over, and get up and write and try to write. And my question is, with regard to the last section of your book, which is habit, okay?
Mm-hmm.
What is, like, in your mind, the most important things that we need to do with respect to habit?
So I love that idea. And Stephen King on Writing is my favorite book on writing. I think it's a fantastic book. And I love the way he explains the process. It's fantastic. And I've read a lot of them, and that's my favorite. But I want to complicate that idea a little bit, because I think there's something I read in the course of doing the research for this latest book, for Anatomy of a Breakthrough, that made me think a bit differently about that process of churning out, say, 2,000 words, was that there's an interview with a songwriter and a writer, Jeff Tweedy, who is the frontman of a band called Wilco. And he also writes books. And he's written a lot about depression and his experiences of the world and what it's like to be a musician, sort of the musician's version of the Stephen King on Writing book. So he's tremendously productive. He's been writing music and books for decades. He's very, very successful. And he says that often he wakes up in the morning just in the same way as Dennis Prager, and says, I don't want to do this. This is not fun. Like, I don't want to pray. I don't want to write. And that's his job. He has to do it. Now, you can do the Stephen King thing where you say, well, I'm just going to sit down till I write 2,000 words. But what Tweedy has done, which I think is such a clever twist on the idea, is he says, when it's hard, if you start by lowering your threshold for the quality of what you're writing, then suddenly you find that you're in a much better place. So what he'll do is he'll say to himself, I try to pour out. He uses the analogy of pouring out the bad ideas, like there's kind of dirty stuff in your head that you got to pour out for the good stuff to shine through. And he says he'll spend 10 or 15 minutes trying to write the worst sentences he can, or the most boring musical phrase he can, which is very easy because he's good at writing and he's good at writing music. So he'll come up with the worst things he can. They're boring. They're maybe, if it's some kind of music that he doesn't want to be writing. But what that does is it does two things. One thing is often it's better than you thought it was. So then it gives you ideas, it inspires you for after that 15 minutes for what comes next. But even if it doesn't, even if you have to discard that first 15 minutes, because you've lowered the threshold so much, you've shown yourself that you can make progress. When the threshold is low and you're producing, it gets the wheels in motion. It says to you, it signals to you that you're capable of making progress. And then you start to get better from there. Because the wheels are being greased and you're moving in the right direction, it's easier to do good work if you've done bad work before it, rather than going from 0 to 100. And I love that idea. And actually, in writing this book, I used that approach. There were days when I woke up and I didn't want to write. So I wrote the worst opening to a chapter I could think of. And one of them ended up being a chapter opening. I tweaked it a little bit. And it's just so true.
This is great. You know what Barry Schwartz told me, that I asked him about productivity. He said, I always finish at the end of the day in the middle of a sentence that I know what will be the next day, because I don't want to be, in front of an empty page. And my problem with Stephen King, and again, On Writing is also my favorite writing book. I wrote 4 books. Okay. So I'm in the book writing thing, and I gave this 2,000 or 1,000 word advice of Stephen King to many people, even to myself, but I didn't manage to do it. And I suspect that neither do you. So this is great for Stephen King because he's a giant.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that this process, this creative process, and he has like this personality where he kept standing short stories until the nail was couldn't bear all the rejections.
Yeah.
This is a Stephen King personality, and this is why he's the most read author in the 20th century. It's not me. So how can I take inspiration from Stephen King and adjust it to my reality?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think for me personally, I agree with you. I don't do the 2,000 words a day approach.
It's very hard. Even
Well,
1,000 each day, it's very hard.
I don't think it's just hard, though. I think it's hard, but I think you can do it. You could do it, and I could do it. I just don't think it's going to bring out my best work. And the reason for that is that I am a human who has incredible days and not so good days, like most people. Stephen King is just consistently great. You know, he's always above the bar. I don't feel that way about myself when I'm writing. So there are days when I'll spend the entire day working on one sentence, and I'll write 7 words. And then there's another day where I'll write 12,000 words. This has happened. It's a miracle. It happens very rarely. But when you look at the book is lumpy, just like everything in life. To be honest, that's the way life works, is that we don't have 2,000 words a day lives. That's not how life works. It's life where 12,000 words, then 10 words, then 8 words, then 15 words, then 3,000 words, but then 12 words again. And when you put that all together, if you bracket broadly enough, you have a book. You have 100,000 words. But if you're the kind of person who says, you know, day to day, am I failing? You know, I'm a great success when I write 15,000 words, and then the next day I'm a failure. That's an absurd way to consider your own sort of summary of who you are as a writer. And so one thing I've tried to do is to be more lenient and to focus on the whole product. Am I writing in a month the number of words I want to write? Whether it's 2,000 words a day, so 60,000 words in a month, I would never do that. I'll never write 60,000 words a month. Whatever the threshold is that matters to me, am I roughly meeting that goal over a month? Because a day is just too small a window for me to be able to say, I failed that day, I succeeded that day. It just doesn't make sense. So that's the most useful thing, is to bracket much more broadly.
This is why I'm so much in love with the concept of a semester. It's more than a month. It is less than a year, and one can see genuinely progress in one semester. So the term semester is great. And I would like to also offer our viewers the book, or the great book, Daily Rituals, How Artists Works. And it has many, many artists and their work in progress. Some of the artists, you know, could write like 7 words in one day, and other write. It is so... The difference, the variance between how artists work is so huge that I think this book is mind-blowing. Adam Alter, thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom and your great book. And it was a pleasure speaking with you.
And you, Roy, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
And you know, I usually ask my guests, could you give me one productivity tip? But you gave me about our entire talk about, it was about productivity, but I will ask you, can you give me just one book that you read in the last 10 years that, you know, really changed something in the way that you see life?
Yeah, a friend of mine, Oliver Burkeman, which I'm sure a lot of your viewers know about, his fantastic book, 4,000 Weeks, is the book that I think has changed my life the most in the last couple of years. So I'll mention that one. I haven't prepared for this question. I always like to go to my bookshelf and look at all the books I've read. But that's one that really stands out. And it's basically a book that talks about time in a way that I find really refreshing. So you have lots of books like mine that tell you how to get unstuck and how to make progress. But one of the nice things about Oliver's book is he basically says the whole act of living your life through the prism of productivity and how am I using my time and am I bracketing appropriately, all of that is a losing battle. And he offers an alternative philosophy that's much more lenient and I think much more conducive to human flourishing. I'm not saying my book is not useful. Okay. It's just a very different way of looking at things. And I found it really refreshing and interesting. He's a very bright guy.
And the second question is, just name another guest that you think will be very interesting, but I think that you just offered Oliver.
Oliver's fantastic. If you can approach Oliver and get him when he has some time. I think he'd be fantastic. I'll offer one more name, a colleague of mine and a very good friend, Hal Hirschfield, who is a professor at UCLA. He's tremendous. He's written a book, and we worked on some research together, but he's just written a book called Your Future Self. And it's also, since we were just speaking about time and productivity and how to make good decisions for the long run, his book is about prioritizing who you'll be in the future and how hard it is for us to do that as a species. It's a really wonderful book.
Wow, this is great. Adam Alter, thank you so much. And I hope that you do visit Israel in the next couple of years. And I will be more than happy to have you as a guest.
Thank you so much, Roy. I appreciate it. I'd love to visit sometime for sure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All the best.